Hey y'all. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Simeon. Y'all know me. I'm the Executive Director of the Historic Districts Council. This is part of our Preservation School program, which is funded by a number of delightful public servants and the Department of Cultural Affairs. So thank them all very much. All right, so, okay. Preservation tools for New York City. Go. So, preserving historic buildings. I mean, the purpose here is sort of talk about preservation in a broader sense and just really work on a few of the more common tools that we can find in New York. As everyone knows, New York City is a unique regulatory environment. So what we've tried to do is identify those tools that are most usable in the city. If we lived in a small town somewhere, it would be different. If we lived in Europe, it would be different. If we lived in anywhere except New York City, it would be different. We're stuck with New York City. It's a dirty, smelly, expensive city, but it's ours and we love it. So the basic concept is preserving historic buildings has a multitude of social and economic benefits. All right, I mean, you got to start from the scratch. Why are you doing this? Why you're saving buildings? For example, historic preservation attracts visitors. There are 54.3 million people who visited New York in 2013, and they went to many, many historic sites. There are numbers there. It's 89% of international cultural tourists took sightseeing tours. 50% of international tourists visited historic landmarks. It's a lot of people. It's a lot of people coming into our city, clogging our subways and not actually helping. But regardless, it actually helps feed the city and keep it active. Historic preservation enhances tourism, in fact, also. Close to $40 billion was spent in 2013, generating over $20 billion in wages. And that's 2013 money. God knows what that means today. I'm hoping it'd be more today, but I'm not really sure. So, and many of our historic landmarks are major tourist attractions. People go to Carnegie Hall. The Broadway theaters are a major preservation success story. I don't know if people remember, but 30 years ago they were talking about closing all of them and knocking them down and putting up some large office buildings. And today they are a multi-billion-dollar industry that employs hundreds, if not thousands of people, and really is one of the premier arts industries in the country. Historic preservation also supports better jobs. There's a mess of construction jobs that were created in New York, 24,000 construction jobs between 2001 2013, and historic preservation practices create proportionally more jobs and higher paying jobs than new construction. This is something to absorb. Realize that when you're actually getting someone to restore a building or work on a building or adaptively reuse a building, that is a higher skill set. It's more labor intensive than getting drywall from Indianapolis or wherever they make drywall and sort of throwing it up. So you're actually, and when you're employing more labor, that money goes back into the city as opposed to going to Indianapolis to pay for all that drywall. So it's better for New York in general. Historic preservation also generates investment. There's a 20% tax credit still, thank God, that historic properties can receive from a federal tax credit for substantial renovations. Those are for income-producing properties. And that generated just bags and bags of money through a couple of really prime projects. There's also a New York State tax credit, which is income limited and also supports not-for-profits, which is voluntary but allows for more investment to work into our older buildings.
How much is the New York State tax credit?
Later, we will talk about things like that. The real importance of preservation, however, is that the continued existence of a physical past is essentially important to the stability of a shared culture, because it's an ugly thing to live in a timeless place. If you have a place that has no past whatsoever, what's the point of building anything? You're just sort of in this giant white room where it's trackless, where you're left rudderless. That, by the way, is Admiral's Row in the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was that.
They were trying to save that, weren't they?
We tried very hard to save it for a very long time and we're not successful. Okay, so where do preservationists come from? Right? Who are all these people who wanting to preserve? We got community organizations, we got block associations, neighborhood organizations, local history groups, specific issue groups, Save the Theater, Save the Clock Tower, Save the Library. You've got special purpose historic preservation organizations, which are interested in building materials like cast iron and terracotta, and God knows, galvanized nails or something like that. You've got historic period and style. You got the Beaux Arts Alliance. You've got an active Victorian society, a modern movement society, the Art Deco Society. Also, we've sponsored things in collaboration with them. You got civic organizations and good government groups, the Queen's Civic Congress, the City Club of New York. You've got cultural institutions. They do their part. They help educate. There's New York Historical. There is the Museum of the City of New York. And you even have government agencies which help generate preservation activity. City Planning Commission, the Parks Department is filled with preservationists, whether or not you agree with every single thing that agency does. There are people who really love the city, and of course our friends, the Landmarks Preservation Commission, about whom I will speak a lot. Right? But let me talk about the Historic Districts Council briefly. HDC is the advocate for New York's historic neighborhoods. We are dedicated, this is our official mission statement. The Historic Districts Council is the advocate for New York's designated historic districts and for neighborhoods meriting preservation. People are always like, how come you're talking about something if it's not a historic district? I'm like, because we talk about all of the neighborhoods. We're dedicated to preserving, protecting the integrity of New York City's landmarks law and to furthering the preservation ethic, which allows me to sit in front of you and talk about this because this is furthering the preservation ethic. We were formed in 1970 as a coalition of individuals and community groups from the city's designated historic districts and potential historic districts. We were incorporated as an independent organization in 1985. Originally, we were a committee of the Municipal Art Society, like our colleagues, the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and our primary constituency is over 500 neighborhood-based groups. Here you are staring into a mirror of people in the past, in this room, in a classroom, yet you're in the classroom, in this room. Contemplate that and the wonder of reality. Okay, so see, here are some of our 500 groups. Just some of them, right? Yeah, it's terrible. These are wonderful people. When I say 500, that is a real number, although we probably only talk to about half of them on a regular basis. But we have contact with in 500 neighborhood-based groups, almost all of whom are volunteer throughout all 5 boroughs. This is important to understand that most preservationists don't do this for a living. That most of them are volunteer people. It can be a large group of volunteer people. It can be a small group of volunteer people who are meeting in their homes, around kitchen tables, in coffee shops, just concerned about their neighborhoods, concerned about their spaces, and wanting to figure out what they can do. There are a number of staffed organizations. Here are a few of them. This is pretty much it. The Brooklyn Heights Association is a staffed neighborhood organization that preservation is a big priority of. The City Club of New York is actually is not staffed. It's a good government group that has sort of emerged and reinvigorated a lot of the old school, the old guard. That's the word for it. The old guard preservationists got together and are working on public policy issues. Friends of the Upper East Side Historic Districts deal with the Upper East Side Historic Districts from 60th Street to 96th Street, Park to the River. Greenwich Village Society for Historic Preservation deals pretty much 14th Street to Houston Street, river to river. Historic Districts Council, we've talked about them. There's Landmark West, which is the Upper West Side, sort of a counterpart to the Friends of the Upper East Side. The Municipal Art Society, who is a 125-year-old this year. A good government group that was the progenitor of ourselves in the Landmarks Conservancy. The Landmarks Conservancy spun off a little earlier than we did, whereas HDC does focuses more on advocacy and community development. The Landmarks Conservancy focuses more on technical assistance and really. We both do. They do a lot of policy work. And they maintain and do a lot of financial assistance. They actually have architects on their staff who can help with projects, and they manage the largest preservation revolving loan program in the country, they've given out something along the lines of $100 million over 25 years.
Wow.
Don't quote me on that number, but it's a surprising amount. They have like several $1 million out in loans at any given time. So, strategies for preservation. All right, so you're a group or you're a person, you're interested in it. You've got a space that you want to save. So, what are your basic strategies for preservation? Well, the first one is, of course, you accept the inevitability of change and make peace with yourself. That is probably the easiest and most controlled way of doing it. You have a couple of bad evenings, take a long walk, put your feet up, and kind of, deal with it your own. If that doesn't work for you, another strategy, very successful, is buying the property. I'm deadly serious. This is a very good way to save a property if you can buy it. The third way, really, of doing it is try to control the property in some way. So, you can either make peace with yourself, buy the property, or control it. I'm not going to go into making peace with yourself because that's between you and yourself. But let's talk about buying the property. Well, you got a property you care about, and you purchase it. Or you get somebody you trust to purchase the property. That somebody who you trust to purchase the property often can be the government. This is actually a strategy that can work in New York City. You can, in fact, convince the appropriate government agency to take possession of property for preservation purposes. It's hard, it's an extraordinarily long and complicated process, and it leaves you still having to negotiate with what happens to the property in the future. But that is how all of the historic houses, museums in New York ended up happening. Eventually, someone got the government to step in and take control of that property and own it. Those are mostly all owned by the Parks Department. And again, if you have the money swimming around and you want to purchase the property, you can just purchase a property and then you're good to go. Quite serious. That is how it's done in most other places. They're very smart about that. Unfortunately, they don't have to deal with our high land cost. So let's talk about controlling the property, assuming that we can't convince government to buy it and we don't have the money to buy it. So you can rezone the property to encourage preservation, making sure that the underlying zoning aligns with the existing built fabric. You can gain official recognition of the property's historic significance, i.e. get it on the National Register of Historic Places, or you can gain protection for the property's historic character, i.e. get it designated by the Landmarks Preservation Commission. These are the three principal means of controlling property in New York City if you're not going to buy it. These three means can happen at the same time. You can try to rezone, designate, and get on the National Register. They are three separate, though interrelated processes, and deal with three separate agencies. I'm not going to really talk about rezoning much. That in and of itself is a long, complicated, and very interesting, if you like that sort of thing, topic that many, many books are written about, and it is beyond the scope of this presentation. Needless to say, it's illegal, by the way, to rezone one property. You need to rezone an area. If you try to rezone just one property, it's called spot zoning, and it's actually illegal. So you need to, yes, it is. You can get a variance. You can get you can get special permits to change the zoning on, change the way the zoning is interpreted, but you can't actually rezone a property per se, because that's spot zoning. You need to zone an area. That area could be one block, but. So let's talk about listing on the State and National Register of Historic Places, which is the gaining recognition for its historic character. Now, something that's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, which is also mirrored by the New York State Register of Historic Places, I'm just for the purposes of not exhausting myself, going to call it National Register listing, is a district, site, building, structure, or object that possesses integrity of location, design, setting, materials, workmanship, feeling, and association, and is 50 years old or older. That is, and these are called the 4 criteria of National Register listing. It has to be associated with events that made a significant contribution to the broad patterns of our history. i.e., Gettysburg Battlefield. It has to be associated with the lives of, or it has to be associated with the lives of significant persons in our past, i.e., George Washington's house on the Gettysburg battlefield. Or 3, it needs to embody distinct characteristics of a type, period, or method of construction, or represent the work of a master that possesses high artistic values that represent a significant distinguishable entity whose components may lack individual distinction. Yeah, that's complicated. It has to be the work of a master. So it has to be have been built, it can be built by Thomas Jefferson for George Washington on Gettysburg battlefield. That'd be 3 things altogether. Or it could be just a house by Thomas Jefferson, or George Washington could have lived there, or it could have been a battlefield. Or then D, it needs to be archaeologically significant, i.e. you could find out something important about how George Washington lived in the space because of archaeological remains.
But A, B, C, and D are all necessary.
No, it's
They
and
are
ors.
ors.
It's and ors. And or.
Oh, I see.
Can you explain architectural significance again? Go.
The C,
D, I think.
D is archaeological. That's archaeology. It's yielded or might be likely to yield information important to history or prehistory. That is an Indian burial site. That's a Native American burial site. That is remnants of a fort. Again, it's archaeological. That's their archaeological criteria. Also, all of this stuff. So it's gotta satisfy one of these 4 criteria. Better if it satisfies many of them, but at least one of these 4. And it's been placed on the National Register of Historic Places by the U.S. Department of Interior. Significance is in the eye of the beholder, and people know significance when they see it. Is it the first tailor in a neighborhood? Is that significant? Maybe, depends on the neighborhood. You know, was that tailor later go on to become the mayor of the town? Then it might be a little more significant. Is he the 4th tailor who was in the town sometime in the 1940s? He was only a tailor for a couple of years, and then he went on and became a milliner? Maybe not. So there's that question of significance. And these are things that people struggle with, and when I say people, the National Register of Historic Places, it's all overseen by the State Historic Preservation Office.
The only problem with the National Register.
We're not gonna there. Don't jump me, Gene. So, National Register listing is overseen by the New York State Office of Historic Preservation. It regulates public development. It does not regulate private development. So it only regulates when you're using public money. Classic being, of course, road widenings, but on a more serious, a more common level out here would be the development of a school or a library or the city doing something. Then National Register really has teeth in it. If you want to use private money, that's not the case. It has advisory authority in the sense it's not binding. Even the State Historic Preservation Office, who oversees it, they say you shouldn't do this, but if the agency has a compelling reason to do what they're proposing, they can push their plan forward. It's part of environmental review, but it does offer tax credits to commercial and income-limited property owners. In answer to your question earlier, there's a 20% federal tax credit. New York State also matches that 20% tax credit for income-limited and commercial properties to the extent of almost 40% property tax credit on approved and overseen historic rehabilitation. Now, so that's the thing about National Register listing. Now, again, let me reframe it doesn't affect private dollars. You can own a property that's on the National Register, and if you want to use private money to knock it down, you want to use your own money to knock it down, it can get knocked down. So that's not really helpful necessarily. It's great that they allow for tax credits, but it's not the most helpful thing. So there's the third thing that we talked about back then, which is New York City Landmark status, which is gaining protection for the historic character of a property. Now, a New York City landmark is any physical improvement or landscape feature which any part of which is 30 years old or older, has a special character, special historical, aesthetic interest or value as part of the development, heritage, or cultural characteristics of the city, state, or nation. That is what a landmark is, but it has to be designated by the Landmarks Commission. So the Landmarks Commission looks for all those qualities, 30 years older, special character, on a couple of different levels, and then designates. Now, New York City Landmark Designation is overseen by the mayoral agency, the Landmarks Preservation Commission. It regulates all development, private and public. It's got binding authority. They have to listen to the Landmarks Commission. You can't actually appeal a decision by the Landmarks Commission. State Historic Preservation Office, they're supposed to listen. But Landmarks has real teeth. It doesn't trigger environmental review, and there are very small grants to nonprofits and income-limited property owners. They're very small.
How small?
Very small and not very open to most people. You have to basically satisfy Section 8 housing requirements if you are an individual. All right, so what landmarking does and doesn't do. So New York City landmarking regulates all physical development, but it doesn't affect usage, okay? So you can talk about a storefront, you can talk about changes to a storefront, but that store can be anything the zoning allows. You can't say it's got to be a restaurant, it's got to be a nail salon, it's got to be a bookstore. It can be anything they want, they just deal with the physical character. It discourages demolition. There are landmark properties that are demolished. We see about a dozen requests a year, but by and large, it discourages demolition. It does not maintain specific businesses. People often are like, we need to landmark cafe, name your cafe. Cafe Edison, that was a famous one a couple of years ago. People were very upset. Oh my God, we need to save Cafe Edison. It's gotta be a landmark. Even if they wanted to landmark Cafe Edison, it would not have saved Cafe Edison. The interior of the Four Seasons restaurant, which is is an interior landmark, a very rare thing. There are only 120 interior landmarks in New York City. It was designated as the Four Seasons restaurant. The Four Seasons lost their lease. Their landlord kicked them out. It is no longer the Four Seasons restaurant. It still looks the same, but the guys they changed owners, they changed menus. It still basically looks the same. It's now even more expensive if one can imagine such a thing. But landmarking requires rudimentary maintenance of a property. You gotta keep it watertight. It doesn't require restoration. Just make sure that the building doesn't fall down. And it requires government permission and encourages community input on private development, which is really important. Most places in New York City are as of right. Landmark buildings are the only buildings that typically the community has a chance to weigh in on the future of. Because this is New York City, of course, landmarking does not provide financial incentives for development or really rehabilitative work. It's one of those things. It's all stick and very little carrot. Important dates in New York City preservation history. 1961, Mayor Wagner appointed a committee to study landmarks legislation. 1963, Pennsylvania Station was demolished. You can see pictures there. On your left is Pennsylvania Station when it was in its final form. Actually, not its final form, its best form. They later blacked out a lot of that. And then, that's 1963. Those are important to note because 1965, Mayor Wagner signs the Landmarks Law. Many people feel that the Landmarks Law was created because of the demolition of Pennsylvania Station, and the fact of the matter is, no, it was not. They were completely aware that that Pennsylvania Station was going to be knocked down while they were contemplating it. They started and opened up conversations around that issue already, but it took a while, and they realized they were going to lose it. The New York Times actually opined At the time, this is back when the New York Times both reported on local press and preservation was considered something good enough. Honestly. Ada Louise Huxtable, who was their first architecture critic, won a Pulitzer Prize, said, we will be remembered not by the monuments we create, but by those we destroy. And furthermore, we are a tin horn culture and we deserve tin horn architecture.
Wasn't it the demolition of a mansion that really invigorated the landmarks law?
There were a lot of mansions. You're talking about the Clark Mansion that really kind of pushed everything over the edge at the last minute. So yes, it was on the Upper East Side of the Clark Mansion. We had lost, in the 1950s and 1960s, we lost a lot of the great old Gilded Age mansions at the time, and because of urban renewal and all sorts of good reasons. Next couple of dates in preservation history that are important is 1979, which it was Penn Central versus U.S. was decided. This was the case that it was decided by the United States Supreme Court. This is the case actually that showed that preservation is not a taking and did not violate Fourth and Tenth Amendment rights. Up until that point, there were some serious and meaningful constitutional concerns about landmarking, and in fact, in a general sense, about zoning in general. Whether or not this was an effective use of government power. After that, the next really important dates would be a number of small additions to the landmarks law. It was once again proven in, there was a Broadway Theaters lawsuit that again allowed for the Landmarks Commission to say that it is the right thing to do to preserve it. In the early 2000s, the landmarks law was actually opened up and allowed to fine on a civil basis for demolition by neglect cases. It's very. Sorry? No, there was no specific thing that caused that particular law. That was in 2005, and basically they said up until that point, the Landmarks Commission was not allowed to actually file lawsuits to insist that people keep up their landmark buildings. Since then, in the last 13 years, they've done about close to 24 cases, which are very complicated, all of them, but have succeeded in actually saving a bunch of buildings. Then most recently, in 2016, the City Council once again changed the landmarks law to put certain time frames on how often the LPC can act to designate. This actually was not a positive thing. In fact, has created a situation where the Landmarks Commission is now constrained to only have a few, like 2 years to consider a landmark district or not. We lost a bunch of landmarks because of that. That was the big backlog controversy, and in fact, one of the historic districts in Staten Island that we had been working on for ever so long, the Harrison Street district, was kicked off of the agenda after waiting for 8 years. They finally said, we're not going to do this, not based on any sort of merit, but on basically based on politics of the situation. Okay, so just basically the New York City Administrative, I knew I was going to miss something. The Administrative Code, which is Section 25301 of the New York City Administrative Code, the landmarks law itself, states these are the reasons for landmarks. The benefits of landmarking properties are they protect the city's heritage, they stabilize and improve property values, they foster civic pride, they enhance tourism, they strengthen the economy, and they promote public education. Notice in that it doesn't say anything about keeping things affordable. It doesn't say anything about quality of, specific quality of life. A lot of the issues that people have brought up and say, how come the Landmarks Commission, doesn't do this or does do this or doesn't do the other thing? And the answer is because this was a law written in 1965 for these reasons, and it's done it quite well. There are other issues and other laws if people want to do such things. that they should look into doing. But this is the law that we have, and it's worked quite well for over 50 years. Yeah, okay. Also, by the way, I am beholden as a professional preservationist to include a picture of Jacqueline Kenny Onassis in every presentation I do. That is, of course, Mrs. Onassis in the middle. She is standing next to Philip Johnson, modern architect and noted Nazi. And then all the way on her far right is Mayor Koch. Next to him is his beard, and later his Consumer Affairs Commissioner, Bess Meyerson, the first Jewish Miss America in 1945. So that's, just to give you sort of sense of this is when they were all campaigning to save Grand Central. When Penn Central is actually about Grand Central, because at that point in time the Pennsylvania Railroad owned the Grand Central Terminal. Okay, so there are 1,408 individual landmarks within New York City. This is the New York Public Library main branch, designated in 1967. There are 143 districts and extensions. Over here on your left is the Gansevoort Market, designated in 2003, and over there on the right is the very small Carroll Gardens Historic District, designated in 1973. 120 interior landmarks, as I mentioned earlier. There's the Chrysler Building, designated in 1978, and then over there is the Waldorf Astoria, designated in 2017. Interior landmarks, by the way, are typically interiors that are publicly accessible, building lobbies, restaurants, theaters. Religious institutions cannot, by law, be designated as interior landmarks. And at the moment, there's a lawsuit going on at the state level, which says that the Landmarks Preservation Commission can force entry into interior landmarks. The Landmarks Preservation Commission does not want this power, and therefore they are appealing this decision. We, of course, want them to have this power, and that's why we allow them to do the lawsuit. Okay, there are 10 scenic landmarks. Here's a Central Park. There are soon to be 11 with the Riegelman Boardwalk, aka the Coney Island Boardwalk, which will be designated by the end of the month. The Landmarks Preservation Commission does not actually particularly regulate scenic landmarks. They all need to be publicly owned. All of the scenic landmarks are owned and maintained by the parks. Well, they're owned by the city. They're maintained by the Parks Department, and in some cases, the Department of Transportation. The Landmarks Commission does not really do much about them, but it serves in an advisory role. So they've talked a lot about landmarks, but this is the properties in New York City. Yeah. 97% of the properties in New York City are not landmarks. People are always like, oh my God, these landmarks, they're killing us. They're killing us. So that's just sort of a graphic there for you. That's a true number. Now, historic districts by borough, and that gives you a sense of where all the historic districts lie. There are reasons for this. Staten Island is still 3 because Harrison Street got kicked off. The reasoning behind this has to do with civic history, neighborhood planning, neighborhood organizations, and politics. And you should keep that in mind as we get to the next section of it. So yes, Manhattan has some of the oldest sections of New York. And so that's the sort of civic history and development history. But it also had people who were willing to fight for those areas, as did Brooklyn, which had some good old areas that were, but not, that were well designed, but so does the Bronx. But the Bronx never had that sort of history of civic activism around trying to preserve a neighborhood character. And then you've got Queens and Staten Island, which of the problem of, although there are some beautiful parts and some historic parts of Queens and Staten Island, the politics of those areas, need I say Donald Maness, were not good for decades and decades and decades. Okay, so what is the landmark designation process? Why you all came here? It's taking me 45 minutes to get here, and it's going to be very boring on the YouTube channel, on the machine, in the film. So, someone proposes properties to the Landmarks Commission. As remember, Landmarks Commission being a mayoral agency. That is your request for evaluation. In your request for evaluation, which is, for a site or for a district, it doesn't really matter. Let's just talk district because it's the same basic strategies. You need to include good photographs. You need to include a clear map of your district. I don't care if you can go on the machine and just Google it. You need to show the basic area, the study area per se that you're looking at. Now, when I say this, you don't need a fancy computer program to do this. You just need a clear map. You need verifiable basic building data. You need to be able to show what's the addresses you're talking about. If you can get the block and lot numbers, that's great too. Don't get any crazier than that if you don't need to, but be very clear. And someone should be able to look at your photographs and have a sense of where that building is. Not, oh, it's on the corner of 90th and Junction Boulevard. No, you need an actual address. And then, and this is where the sort of liberal arts, the English language, history stuff comes in. You need to explain the significance within a context. You have to explain why is this. You have to do this. This is your writing assignment. I.e., what's the cultural importance? What's the importance to New York City's development? This is where you're saying this building is important, this area is important for X, Y, and Z. At the same time, don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. You don't have to do every bit of history from the beginning of time. You don't have to start with the Wisconsin ice sheet. You don't have to talk about the Lenape. You don't have to trace every single person who's owned that specific building since the beginning of time, because the Landmarks Commission is going to have to redo the research anyway. In a best case scenario, they're going to have to prove it. If you have that information, if you have that basic information, if you know the history of who lived there, and especially if it's important to your significance, tell them that. Make the case for your proposal why this is significant. But don't, we worked at HDC, we worked with groups who have spent years going crazy trying to track down every single owner of every single property in for 1,000 properties, and it's impossible. And some people can have a lot of fun doing that, and I'll talk about that later. But at a certain point, you need to sort of give it up. Now, you submit all this stuff to the Landmarks Commission, and then they set a calendar for the hearing. Job well done, right? They will have several meetings with stakeholders, which are advocates, elected officials, affected property owners, before they set the calendar, before they calendar the building for a hearing. This is the critical stage of advocacy where energy must be expended in getting the agency to act. That means this is where your postcards come in. This is where your rallies and your petitions and your meetings with elected officials and your pestering phone calls and everything you can possibly do. This is the stage which most things linger at. It is the easiest thing in the world for a government agency to say no. As an advocate, it is your job to make it difficult for them to say no and to rethink why they're saying no and to get to yes. John.
After Harrison Street, there's a moment when the clock starts ticking?
Once the calendar happens, once they set a calendar,
Okay.
that, thanks to local law 77 of 2016, the clock starts ticking. They then have approximately 2 years to act on a property, which means they are even more loath to calendar something because they know they only have 2 years to act on it.
It's time.
Yes, it's a tight turnaround, all done under the auspices of transparency and efficiency in government. Yeah, let that one sink in for a moment. Okay, so you've managed to do this, okay? You've actually moved off of step 2. Or rather, you've completed step 2, which is they've set the calendar for hearing. You're now calendared. It does happen. I've seen it happen, really. Then the Landmarks Commission has a public hearing. They set the calendar. They have a public hearing. Get everyone you know to show up and submit testimony at this hearing. And prepare press materials to keep momentum going on it. Because, again, there is this timeline. There is shenanigans can happen. You don't want, the Landmarks Commission has made the commitment, but you can't rest on your laurels and you can't assume the agency is going to finish it. They probably will finish the job, but things happen. The Landmarks chair, by the way, just stepped down. So there's going to be a real question of what's happening for a couple of months while everybody figures out what's going on. That sounds weird, but it happened in between Mayor Bloomberg's third term, Mayor Bloomberg and Mayor de Blasio. It takes, changes in administration happen, and then all of a sudden things fall through the cracks. So you've got to keep the pressure on, and you've got to sort of keep it in the public eye.
I'm sorry, did the last slide have the politicians for
The politicians are part of working on getting the Landmarks Commission to move.
they don't have kill power?
We're going to get to that.
Okay.
We're only on stage 3 here. They have the public hearing. You've gotten your politicians to help out. You've gotten them to testify. That's really kind of key. Sometimes they won't do it, but you're going to try to get them there. Then they vote on designation. Everybody's happy and the property's landmarked. This is important. The property's actually landmarked when they act. This is true. However, then you get into the confirmation. So there's a confirmation process. There's a public process for confirmation. It takes 140 days maximum after landmark designation. It goes to city planning for an advisory opinion. City planning has 60 days to vote. No one ever shows up at those hearings, but it's worth it to sort of track them. It goes to the city council for vote, and this is where it's really important to stick the landing.
But going to those city planning is very important, though.
It is. I said that. That's why it's important. You need to kind of keep your eye on it. Goes to the city council for a vote, and you got to make sure to stick the landing. This is the last chance for it to go wrong. That's when shenanigans can happen. I've seen properties get turned back. We all have turned back at city council. I've seen properties get taken out of historic districts. Just whoop, wait, that happened. That happened on the West End Avenue Historic District. Got a couple of buildings just knocked out that no one even talks about.
135 Bowery.
That is what I was referring to. 135 Bowery got turned back. There were 2 properties recently on City Island that got turned back because at the last minute there was property owner objection, and the city council member was decided to be opposed.
So he speaks to, or her colleagues.
Right.
And it goes to the vote.
Mm-hmm.
How about the borough president? Still on the
Borough president is not actually part of this process.
Hmm.
This is not a ULURP process, so it is not. It's a ULURP-like process, but the borough president does not have any official role in this process. So at the city council, you have an opportunity to testify. You need to testify, and this must not be the first time you've talked to your city council member about this. That is deadly. You want your city council member to be fully aware that this is a community-driven project, and that everyone's behind it, and they just need to say yes, and then take their bow, let them cut the ribbon, let them say, look at what I did. It's really tough when you've been working for over a decade to save a building, and then some person who just got elected 2 years ago comes in and says, I saved this, and you're like, yeah, sure you did. That's great. Good on you. Well done. Come to the party. We'll thank you all publicly, because without them, it's like a border guard. City council members are like border guards. They have one power, the power to not let you through a gate.
Well, what happens when, you said
Yeah.
you will have an opportunity to testify?
At the city council vote.
Yes,
Yes.
suppose that we had some people who had an opportunity to testify, and then when they got there, for some reason they didn't get in, or do they, how does that work?
That is a very rare thing for a designation vote at a city council. There are lots of times city council does not run perfectly, and people show up and they can't testify. You can always submit for the record, but you need to let your council member know that you've done this. Obviously, public hearings are wonderful things that are very important to our democracy. It's very important to participate in them. It is slightly innocent to think that anything is really decided at the public hearing itself that's positive. Negative things happen at public hearings all the time. Positive things have been set up and are going to happen beforehand. So you want to be there, and the council members should know, oh look, it's Deborah. Of course Deborah's here. We've been talking about this all week and all month and all year. If you don't show up, they're like, how come Deborah's not here? And then, you know, somebody shows up, you know, Mr. Bulldozer and McDestroyer, and they show up with a whole bunch of people they've hired and start causing trouble, and that can go south. But so you want to show up at the public hearing, but you want to be prepared for it and have done previous work. Then finally, it goes to the mayor for a vote. The mayor, of course, is going to support something that the Landmarks Commission will have designated, because the Landmarks Commission is their agency, so they wouldn't have designated it in the first place without the mayor's approval. That's stage 7. Okay, any questions on the process there?
Can the mayor influence, of course he can, right?
He's the mayor.
The initial process
Yes.
before it comes to him.
Yes. Recently, the mayor, for example, said, we are going to knock down 270 Park Avenue, and that's it. The Landmarks Commission said, okay, we're not going to landmark it. Boom.
Okay.
Okay. What determines landmark designations in no particular order? Community support, political support, inherent worth, and the level of threat to the historic site. These are all things we've been talking about previously. I don't think that we sort of, if anyone, inherent worth being architectural, historical, or cultural. And you know, you kind of know it when you see it. Obstacles to a landmark designation in no particular order are community or property owners' opposition, which translate into political opposition, which is what happened with the 2 properties on City Island. Lack of integrity to the historic site's character. It's lost its windows, porch, door, siding, yard, roof, chimney, everything. And then bureaucratic inertia / lack of agency resources, which is, of course, a classic thing that they always talk about, and it's just your job to remind them what their job is. Now, the best way to do that is work in coalition. Got to work in coalition. Everybody's got one story or another about one person who saved a building. You know, that council member who showed up 2 years ago and voted on it. You know, it's taken a lot of people over a lot of time. And working coalition, you have increased resources because it takes people to accomplish things. You got increased outreach because people know people and everybody has a different network of friends and contacts. And when I say network, I don't mean Facebook friends, although that counts too, but just like they know people. You never know who people might know. You know who you know, but you don't know who your friends know. And increased skills. Not everybody can do everything, but everyone can do something. That's the case of somebody in your group might really like doing building research, but hates public speaking. Another person's really good at talking to business owners and getting them to sign on to this. Another person is really, is really good graphically. Another person, so like people have different skills, and you should figure out how those skills work best together. You also, when you're working coalition, you've got shared experiences and solutions, an opportunity to learn from other people's mistakes and successes. Plus, I've got to say mutual support, because sometimes it's really depressing, and you go for a lot of long nights and a lot of stress unless you use step 1, which is make peace with yourself and accept the inevitability of change. So it's good to have mutual support. And finally, you get a bigger seat at the table to represent decision makers, i.e. elected officials or developers, that you speak for a large group of interested parties. If it's just you, that's okay. But like all of a sudden you got this whole coalition behind you and they're like, what? 7 people showed up for a meeting? That's weird. The steps to a successful preservation campaign: outreach. Doesn't matter how much you love the building, other people need to know that. The first step in outreach is you've got to identify the stakeholders. It is the worst thing in the world. You're like, I don't know what's going on with that building. I don't know who owns it. I don't know what their plans are. Not really sure. People, I don't know. I mean, you've got to figure out who owns the building, who cares about the building, who is making the decisions affecting that building. Doesn't the Parks Department own that lot? No, the Department of Citywide Administrative Services owns that lot. We had a situation we were working on trying to save some ferry bridges in Port Morris, and it took a while to figure out who actually owned the land. We knew it was owned by the city because the police were parking on it, but the police didn't own it. Actually, the Department of Citywide Administrative Services owned it. And what
I
we're,
work with the city, sometimes the city's not sure.
right, often sometimes you can
Which
get,
agents?
exactly, you can get on the phone with somebody and they're like, do you own it? And they're like, I'm not sure. And this is, it's sort of important to figure out. I was talking on the phone the other day with someone and they weren't sure, there was a cemetery involved and they weren't sure who actually owned the cemetery. They wanted to save it. It was great, but we're like, okay, who owns the cemetery?
That's a triangle.
You need to build partnerships because stewardship, what happens to the property after it's designated, after it's protected, is really key to a success. You need to be able to say, I think that this neighborhood is going to go in this direction. I think this property is going to go in this direction. And here's a bunch of people who are interested in it. Education is an important part of outreach. What does landmarking mean? What are its benefits and responsibilities? Do not shy away from telling people there are responsibilities involved. But some of the responsibilities can be benefits, which is, oh my God, I have to talk to the Landmarks Commission if I want to change my windows, but so does my neighbor. And they've got terrible taste. The best thing in the world to be able to do with the landmarks, is when you're talking, for example, to a co-op, a co-op board, and they're like, oh, Landmarks Commission. You're like, actually, it's pretty okay because you can just blame things on the LPC, so that when one of the co-op owners wants to do something to their windows are like what everybody wants to do something to. I don't know why. They're like humankind's natural enemy are windows. So then you say, well, the Landmarks Commission would never allow you to do that. Oh, okay. Well, so that's one of the responsibilities, but it's also a benefit. And you gotta debunk myths about preservation. The building's being given protection. It's not being taken away from you. So for example, one myth, historic preservation raises rents. 55% of New York City households are considered rent burden devoted, which means devoting more than 30% of their income to housing. Historic designation does not affect rental prices. It doesn't. No one believes me when I tell them this. We did a very, very boring, very, very long, very math-intensive report about this. It doesn't affect rental prices. Rents in New York City are simply too high. It has nothing to do with landmarking. And they keep raising in value, but actually, they are not, and people are like, well, historic districts are really expensive places, but that is, correlation is not causation. It is, rents are just too high everywhere. It does not have to do with historic, and we can prove it with math. And if anybody ever really says it, please just tell them to call me and I'll prove it to them with math, and they will stop listening to me because no one wants anything proven to them with math. Historic preservation increases the affordable housing crisis. Okay, there are 4 factors that affect affordable housing: zoning, high land cost, land availability, and development cost. Thing is that historic preservation doesn't dictate use, so it doesn't prevent the redevelopment of a designated property into affordable housing. Period, bottom line. There are examples in areas. Crown Heights North has done a number of affordable housing developments within the designated historic district. Is it easy to develop affordable housing, new affordable housing, within a historic district? No. Is it easy to develop new affordable housing, period? No. I've talked to affordable housing people, and they're like, it's really about land availability and high land cost. We can figure out everything else around it, but they build affordable housing where they can afford to do it. It's very tough. All right, community steps. Finally, when you're making the case, you've got to get really specific about the site. You've got to make it about the specific building. Why is this building important? You've got to make your history accessible. You've got to make the significance really personal. And you can sponsor programs like walking tours and house tours are really great. That's part of your educational outreach. You can create broader awareness through programs such as plaques and brochures and guidebooks. But never forget, because people sometimes get kind of distracted by it, never forget, when you're dealing with the preservation campaign, the goal is to save the building, because the best way to learn about history is to physically encounter it. That's it. Now I'll answer all of your questions for you.
The borough president, they have a lot of I'm gonna say power over the community board. And, I know community boards are very fickle, but it's probably very helpful to have them on your
Yes.
side.
It is.
I mean, okay, Melinda Katz has a terrible reputation. I mean, New York is a town run by developers.
Always
So-
has been.
Yeah. I mean, that is the big
Yeah.
industry.
Yes.
The big industry.
Yes.
And that's part of why Manhattan has the most designations, because like the old Irish man, what do you think of New York? But it's a fine city if they ever finished it.
Right.
The teardown thing. It's like, I think, Americans realized nothing would be left. Anyway, but I digress. Borough president.
What do you do with a problem like Melinda Katz is what you're asking?
Well, you'd have to build up consensus, I think.
Yeah, I mean, what it
is.
is you build up consensus. We have met with the council members in Queens who are pro preservation for their areas. You
Yes.
build consensus by bringing their community in to sit there and say, this is important. We're not asking you to make a big stand about all preservation everywhere. We're asking you
Right.
this specific issue.
Yeah.
We've got a group of people, and we're looking forward to trying to work with you on this.
Yeah.
And then if they start behaving poorly, the way politicians sometimes do, actually in Queens, you have a very vigorous community journalism press. Queens has 5 community newspapers that someone must read because there are 5 of them. And the reporters vary in ability, like reporters do everywhere, but someone reads it, and that reaches, you can have conflict in 2 ways. You can have, these people are standing in the way of economic development, or you can have,
You're just fine.
you can have the politicians, sell land to greedy developer. Both of those sell papers, and that doesn't look good for the policy. I mean, and on the other hand, you can have them, politician saves old church, and that's ways of doing it. And Melinda is a very smart person, has been in this, and she was head of land use for city council. She knows how this thing works.
But in terms of actual vote, this city council has much more power.
Within the process of landmark designation, the borough presidents are not part of the official process. Neither actually are community boards. Most council people, however, will not vote for something that the community board rejects.
So what role does the community board play in the school process?
Community boards have advisory capacity in every single process with the exception of state liquor licenses. Even within the uniform land use review process, community boards' role are advisory. However, they are regarded as a existent form of government where the elected officials can say, well, these people are supposedly representative of the community, whether or not they are is another story, but therefore, when they speak, this is representative of community desires. That's being idealistic about it, but they are advisory. They are a very important advisory voice. At the end of the day, they're advisory. They hate it when you remind them of that.
You also try to vote for a council member who is pro-preservation.
You try to vote for a council member who you like, who respects your community. So inherently, it's pro-preservationists.
Just like to clarify your statement about spot zoning. So one particular building lot cannot be rezoned.
No, you can get it.
You can get a variance within that zoning? but
Yes.
You can't change the zone yourself?
Correct. You can also get a special permit, which is another way of. I mean, there's lots of ways around it. You can go to the Board of Standards and Appeals, which is a variance. You can get a special permit through this Department of City Planning. Those are the 2 basic strategies, but you can't actually just rezone the one property. In fact, we're dealing with that to some degree in a case where somebody is trying to change the zoning resolution and it's only going to affect one site. And we're like, that's spot zoning, that's kind of illegal. Debbie.
In my neighborhood, there are two things I've been pursuing. One is a historic mural from the Harlem Renaissance at the Y, and the other is a street that needs to be dedicated because it's a walk of fame.
I'm sorry, a street or a tree? I misheard you.
Street.
Okay, very good.
This is 135th Street
Uh-huh.
in Harlem. You talked about buildings. There was a section you mentioned, and I'm trying to go back over it. I couldn't locate it. Where in addition to a building, an accessory. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Now, here's the thing, which is that if you're trying to, is there actually a walk of fame on the street? Is it demarked through plaques, stuff like that? Landmarking is not the way of doing that. The way to do that is to make sure that it is a official special sidewalk under the Department of Transportation, and work on that and make sure that it is designated as such that when they replace the sidewalk, which DOT is responsible for paving, they don't do anything stupid.
And the painting in a historic building?
In a historic building, within,
A mural.
is it inside? So it's not a wall mural? It's not an outside wall mural?
No, it's interior.
Interior? Do you have a lot of money to buy it?
No.
Okay. Do you know?
It's painted on the building.
Oh, okay. Do you have money to buy the building?
No.
Okay, that's the easiest way of making sure it stays there. Next job. Do you know who owns the building?
I'm trying to find out.
Okay, well, once you figure out who owns the building, then you can try to convince them to keep the mural there. I mean, there are strategies after that, but it's when you're dealing with the inside of a building, that is, private property, and that is taken quite seriously in this jurisprudence.
I think some of the great museums and art institutions should be aware of it, if it was by a noted painter, and if it's from the...
If they are, nothing's been done.
Well, because they would, well, for one thing, in the worst case scenario, it may be removable.
It's not.
It's paint on masonry?
It's painted onto a stone wall, so it's pretty difficult to remove that.
Recently, there was a case on 14th Street in Chelsea where there was a mural that was fortunately easy to remove, and the building was getting demolished, and somebody appealed to the people demolishing the building, and they have removed the mural and ostensibly will put it somewhere in the new development. That's a tough one. Anything else?
I still think the museums would be your friend, and they'll increase the awareness and give options. A lot of times these developers, they don't know that you can design your project around these things. It could have happened with the 5 walls, whatever, the graffiti thing in Long Island.
5 points.
Well,
Yeah,
you have a good point. I'm gonna
But
find
it
out.
takes a little imagination and publicity, a lot of
There are other
publicity.
murals that have been restored, and I need to find out who they were, and
Yeah.
maybe the interest will carry over.
Right.
Good point. Thank you.
I mean, some of the, some stuff by Stuart Davis was found at Newark Airport, and these are discoveries, and it's like, there's an expression in engineering, we can do anything for a price.
Yeah.
Right.
And the most important thing is first find out who owns the place.
There's a piece of artwork on a building on Broadway and Houston. And they-
Frosty Meyer.
on the side of the building.
That's
they-
Frosty Meyer's wall. It was part of the city wall project.
Yeah, and did they take it down and have to put it back up again?
That was a complicated issue.
But in the end, didn't the preservation forces win on that?
It's a complicated issue. Yes, it is mostly there. Again, when you get too deep in any of the specifics in preservation, and this is something that we've been dealing with the Landmarks Commission, you may have heard the Landmarks Commission recently is looking at revising their rules on how they deal with the 36,000 buildings they oversee. The difficulty is, of course, these are all landmark buildings, and they all have their own story, and they all have their specifics. What we learned from Frosty, is called the wall. It's very difficult. that he put a sculpture called The Wall on a wall. But what we learned from Frosty Meyer's wall is not necessarily applicable to other situations, because that was done at a certain moment underneath, when the Landmarks Commission, it was, it sort of fell under Landmarks oversight, except no one could find the permits. It was done by a not-for-profit. That was a city agent that was, working under a city contract. No one could find who owned, the responsibilities for that wall. Frosty knew that Frosty still had the sort of legal, he had it as the intellectual property on that wall, but its placement was, it was really, really, really just foolishly complicated. And it was partially removed, and a negotiation ended up happening because the people whose building it was on wanted to remove it in order to rent out the wall for bags and bags of money for advertising. Of course, the only reason why they had it for bags and bags of money for advertising was because of the underlying zoning of Soho, plus the fact that it had been, that was a party wall that should have never actually been exposed in the first place. But when Robert Moses expanded Houston Street, he demolished some of the buildings there, so you had all these blank walls that were in a manufacturing zone that perchance ended up functioning as huge legal advertising billboards. Plus, the wall was the party wall, which should have never been exposed in the first place, and had some structural damage to it because for 30 years, water and stuff. It's a mess. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simeon, thank you very
You're
much.
So I like all the spirited comments about politicians. This is going to be on the YouTube as well.
Oh yeah, whatever he's putting on there.